Well, good morning. This is the Lou Rockwell Show, and how great to have as our guest from Bahrain, Yousif Almoayyed. Yousif is a successful young businessman in Bahrain. He's the director of the National Concrete Company. He's an avid student of Austrian economics and of non-interventionism. In fact, he told me that when he was a student in China, where we studied electronics and telecommunications for 6 years, and he, by the way, is a fluent speaker of Mandarin Chinese, that it was seeing the role of the Chinese state in the economy there that made him into a non-interventionist. You and your wife were observers at the Mises University this summer, and I was very struck in one of Judge Napolitano's classes where he was asking the non-American students there, did they still think of America as a place to immigrate to, or were they concerned about that it was becoming much less free than their own countries? He asked you, and you said, well, of course, I would never think of immigrating to the United States. We don't have any taxes in Bahrain. And then you told a wonderful story about some people from, at least I guess, a government-allied company seeking to find out from you where you kept your personal money and where the company kept its money. Was it overseas? Was it at home? And so forth. And you told them, gee, no thanks, I don't want to tell you that information. So a very different situation from the U.S. But tell us, what is it like to do? Tell me, what's it like to do business in Bahrain?
Thank you, Lou, for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. There are lots of things I learned from the Mises Institute, and it made me aware of a lot of things. It made me more aware of my history and the history of the region around me in the Middle East. The factors which in the past led to this region thriving and what led to its decline. In the class, when Judge Napolitano asked if young people thought they'd like to move to the US, I told him definitely no, because back home, we feel a lot more free than we feel in the US, especially in terms of your finances. I know in the US that they emphasize freedom of speech, personal freedom, but in terms of your finances, you're very not free. I don't think most people in the US, I don't think they compare with the rest of the world. Like when an American citizen travels overseas, they still have to pay taxes. There are just a few countries that do that, like the US and Israel and Eritrea. It's not a common thing for you to be taxed when you leave your country.
Of course, it's absolutely true. If you leave the U.S. and you move to, say, France, you're earning an income in France. The U.S. wants a piece of that. So, as you say, this is a very unusual, tyrannical, of course, practice in the world. Fear that it might become more frequent as the world seems to be following the U.S. into a more totalitarian and Keynesian direction. But at least so far, it's not. I mean, most countries are much more civilized about taxes and don't do that.
I think it's much harder to do in a lot of places, but because most American citizens never leave their country, so they're not aware of this. They don't compare with overseas what's the norm.
No, it's true that Americans are so unbelievably provincial. I sometimes think maybe that's always been the case with empires. I don't imagine that the average Roman cared much about what the Gauls thought or the Spanish or whatever. They had to conform to the Roman standard and speak Latin and so forth. I mean, it's just another argument against empire.
The country is very big. I mean, the U.S. is huge. There are lots of places to go without leaving.
Before we go on, just tell us, I mean, you mentioned that there are no income taxes, no corporate income taxes, no inheritance taxes, and so forth in Bahrain.
I'll tell you with the region which I'm familiar with, which is the Gulf region, the region that produces oil. It's very interesting because you have two economies. You have an economy that's completely controlled by the government, and you have a completely private economy, which has no taxes. You have no personal income tax. You have no corporate tax. We don't have inheritance tax, but we do have import taxes. But they're very low. They're maybe 5% or lower. And there is some trade restriction with the countries nearby. So we're not completely a free trade zone. A neighboring country, which is the United Arab Emirates, I'm sure you must have heard of Dubai.
Yeah, yes, of course.
What they did is they're the freest market in the region. That brings in a lot of money from the rest of the world, from India, Pakistan, Iran, the Gulf region, everywhere. All trade is going through there now. That's the trend here. And unfortunately, before Bahrain used to be in this position, and it no longer holds this position. It's losing to Dubai.
Anybody arguing that the way to compete with Dubai is to become freer? Besides you,
there are, of course, there are people arguing this, but unfortunately, there are security concerns. There are a lot of hurdles like bureaucracy. I'll tell you a story actually, which has to do with our company. You know, Ford, the Ford Motor Company. Mm-hmm. They used to have their headquarters in Bahrain, but when they refused to give a visa to a Lebanese guy, an American of Lebanese origin, they just decided to just move their headquarters to Dubai, where they won't encounter such troubles. And the reason is because at that time there was the Lebanese war. You know, there are some Shia Sunni tensions in Bahrain, but it's not a really big problem in Bahrain as it is in Iraq or other places in the world. But there are some security concerns of like Iran interfering in Bahrain's affairs and stuff like that.
Yousif, ever since the end of the Cold War, which was I can still remember seeing George H.W. Bush and James Baker, the Secretary of State, on the television when the Berlin Wall came down, and they were just stricken. I mean, their faces were white. These were clearly not happy guys, and of course they were losing their enemy. I mean, an imperial state, maybe every state, is always warning people, hey, those guys over the next hill, they're going to get us if you don't give us all your money and your kids and make war. So as the U.S., I'm afraid, searched for another enemy, they picked Islam. So Islam is typically demonized in the United States. I had an article the other day on LRC talking about what was more violent, the Old Testament or the Quran. And of course, the Old Testament is a very violent book, with all kinds of horrible things going on in it. But of course, you would never hear that criticized.
I've heard that. I've read some of the violent verses. And I want to just talk about this supposed war on Islam. Unfortunately, today, the people that make the headlines are the extremists. I'll just show you how an extremist might think, okay? Or just the reasoning, the logic behind the extremism. First, they would come up with a hypothesis that America is attacking Islam. And if you look at the evidence, you could say that it's true. And you could conclude that, yes, America is against Islam or any Islamic country. And then you'd say, okay, what's the response to that? Then people would go to extreme responses without looking at the real causes of the problem. And these are the kind of people that are attracted to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. This is how they think and reason. When you look at America's actions abroad, especially invasions of countries, that makes people become much more extreme, and it angers a lot of people, and it becomes very difficult to reason with people.
Very funny that people don't like to be bombed. I mean, it's a very strange phenomenon.
That's true. That's true. I mean, I would say that's a universal value. Nobody likes being bombed, and people have extreme responses. You could compare that to American responses after 9/11. People were confused. They're afraid. They would just go with anything. That was the kind of feeling there. There was anger, and they needed to let it out a lot. I've heard stories of people joining the military, or they just wanting to do something about it. It's the same kind of thinking working here.
No, and of course, virtually no American or very few Americans are aware that the U.S. has been meddling. Maybe that's not quite. I mean, certainly intervening in a dramatic way in the Islamic world ever since probably the end of World War II, but certainly from a military standpoint, ever since the overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953 and the installation of the Shah. So installation of various dictators, pretty horrendous regimes. But, again, it seems to me you can't blame this on a religion. I mean, it's easy enough if somebody would actually, from the outside, examine how many people the U.S. has killed, how many millions of people the U.S. has killed. The U.S., many people think that the U.S. is a Christian country. You might say that, well, Christianity is responsible for these millions of corpses. Of course, I would argue that's not Christianity, but I mean, you could see how somebody not really understanding might think that.
That's true.